Hello, I'm Brian Farrell, and welcome to PACE IT's session on the Introduction to Network Devices, Part 1. Today we're going to be talking about the Open System Interconnection Model, and then we're going to conclude with a brief discussion on some basic network devices. There's a fair amount of ground to cover, but not a whole lot of time, so let's go ahead and begin this session. Of course, I'm going to begin by talking about the Open Systems Interconnection Model. The Open Systems Interconnection Model, or the OSI model, was developed as a way to help disparate computing systems communicate with each other. It created a layered approach, a 7-layer approach to networking. This layered approach not only allows those disparate systems to communicate with each other, but it has the added benefit of helping to create a secure networking environment as well. Security can be placed at the various levels of the OSI model to create a layered security arrangement that will vastly improve the security of an overall network. Knowing networking devices and where they fit into the reference model will help the security engineer to create a more safe, secure, and efficient network. With that covered, let's move on to basic network devices. A switch utilizes an application-specific integrated circuit chip, or an ASIC chip, and it is considered a Layer 2 OSI device. The ASIC chip has specific programming that allows the switch to learn when a device is on the network and which port that device is connected to via that device's Layer 2 MAC address. Managed switches allow for security to be placed on the individual switch ports, creating a more secure networking environment. One caveat with switches, though: a switch will only communicate with local network devices. That means it cannot communicate with remote networks. Then there is the wireless access point, or the WAP. A WAP is a specific type of network bridge that connects or bridges a wireless network segment with a wired network segment. And it is also considered a Layer 2 OSI device. The most common type of WAP bridges an 802.11 wireless network with an 802.3 Ethernet network segment. All wireless access points are capable of utilizing encryption to help ensure a secure networking environment. And because they have that capability, you should ensure that all of your WAPs have encryption enabled. A WAP will also only communicate with local network devices, unless, of course, it's a wireless router. But that's a discussion for a different day. Then we have the multi-layer switch, or the MLS. An MLS provides normal Layer 2 network switching services, but it will also provide Layer 3 or higher OSI model services. The most common MLS is called a Layer 3 switch. It not only utilizes an ASIC chip for switching, but that ASIC chip is also programmed to handle routing functions. This allows the device to communicate and pass data to non-local network devices. The MLS commonly implements security at Layer 2 and higher of the OSI model. MLSs are not very common in small networks due to their expense. Then we have the router. The router is the most common network device for connecting different networks together utilizing the OSI model's Layer 3 logical network information. Unlike the switch, which uses an ASIC chip, the router uses software programming for decision making. Firewalls and access control lists are commonly placed on routers to help secure networks. Speaking about firewalls, a firewall can be placed on routers or hosts. This would mean that it would be software based, or a firewall can be its own device. Usually in that case, it's a network appliance. Firewalls function at multiple layers of the OSI model. Usually you will find them operating at layers 2, 3, 4, and 7. Firewalls block packets from entering or leaving the network, and it can do this through one of two methods. It can use stateless inspection. That's where the firewall will examine every packet against a set of rules. Once the packet matches a rule, the rule is enforced and the specified action is taken. The other method that a firewall can use is stateful inspection. The firewall will only examine the state of the connection between networks. Specifically, when a connection is made from an internal network to an external network, the firewall will not examine any packets that are returning from the external connection. As a general rule, external connections are not allowed to be initiated with the internal network. In other words, a firewall that uses stateful inspection will only allow connections to be made from inside to outside. It will not allow that outside entity to initiate a connection with an inside host. Firewalls are usually the first line of defense in protecting the internal network from outside threats. You can consider the firewall as the police force of the network. Then we have load balancers. A load balancer may also be called a content switch or content filter. Load balancers can be implemented to increase the security of a network by limiting or filtering the content that is allowed to be on the network. A load balancer can be a network appliance that is used to load balance between multiple hosts that contain the same data. That means that they will be spreading out the workload for greater efficiency. Load balancers are commonly used to distribute requests to a server farm among the various servers, helping to ensure that no single server gets overloaded. Last up, we have the proxy server. A proxy server is an appliance that requests resources on behalf of client machines. It's often used to retrieve resources from outside untrusted networks on behalf of the requesting client. A proxy server hides and protects the requesting client. That outside network never gets to see the internal client. Proxy servers can also be utilized to filter allowed content. And finally, a proxy server can also increase network performance by caching or saving commonly requested web pages. That concludes this session on the Introduction to Network Devices Part 1. I talked about the open systems interconnection model, and then I had a brief discussion on some basic network devices. On behalf of PACE IT, thank you for watching this session, and I hope you watch another one soon.
Good day, I'm Brian Farrell, and welcome to PACE IT's session on the Introduction to Network Devices Part 2. Today I'm going to begin with an introduction to the layered security concept, and then I'm going to conclude with a brief discussion on some network devices. There's a fair amount of ground to cover, so let's go ahead and begin this session. I'm going to begin by introducing the layered security concept. Modern networks are composed of multiple layers of devices and applications, which can lead to issues with security. The more layers you have, it's possible the more vulnerabilities that are present. So while this does make the issue of security more complex, it also has the added benefit of supporting the concept of a layered security approach, which could also be called security in depth or defense in depth. Each layer or device can contain its own security methods. This means that if a breach occurs in one area of the network, the rest of the network will remain secure, at least hopefully. It is a best practice to use a layered approach when implementing network security. Many security devices are triggered by a specific action occurring, as in a network packet crosses an interface on a router. This creates a situation in which those devices are only capable of reacting to perceived threats. That in itself can be a weakness in security. On the other hand, some devices are capable of application awareness. This feature allows security devices to make better decisions based on which applications are allowed to operate on the network and which applications are not allowed to cross through it. This is another layer that can be added to the network's security. Some devices that may be application aware include firewalls, proxy servers, and network intrusion detection systems or network intrusion prevention systems. With that, let's move on to some network devices. So we're going to begin by talking about the VPN concentrator. A virtual private network concentrator, or VPN concentrator, will facilitate multiple secure VPN connections to a network. The type of incoming VPN connection to the network will determine what tunneling and encryption the VPN concentrator will implement. Most concentrators can function at multiple layers of the OSI model, specifically at layers 2, 3, and 7. Outside of an internet transaction, most concentrators will function at the network layer, or layer 3 of the OSI model, providing IPsec encryption through a secure tunnel. Let's discuss network intrusion detection systems, or NIDS. A NIDS is a passive system designed to identify when a network breach or an attack against the network is occurring. They're usually designed to inform a network administrator when a breach or attack has occurred, and it can do this through log files, text messages, voicemails, and/or an email notification. A NIDS cannot prevent or stop a breach or an attack on its own, as it's only passive in nature. It receives a copy of all traffic and evaluates it against a set of standards. That standard may be signature-based, which means that it evaluates network traffic for known malware or attack signatures. That standard may be anomaly-based, which means that it evaluates network traffic for suspicious changes. It could be policy-based, which means that it evaluates network traffic against a specific declared security policy. Finally, it may be heuristic-based, which means that it evaluates network traffic against past network behavior, which means that it's looking for changes in expected patterns. Now, the intrusion detection system may be deployed at the host level as well. When it's placed on a host, instead of being called a NIDS, it's called a HIDS. Then there's the Network-Based Intrusion Prevention System, or NIPS. A NIPS is an active system designed to stop a breach or an attack from succeeding in damaging the network. They're usually designed to perform an action or set of actions to stop the malicious activity. Just like the NIDS, the NIPS will inform a network administrator through the use of log files, text messages, voicemail, and/or through email notifications. All traffic on the network system is required to flow through the NIPS to either enter or leave the segment. Like the NIDS, all traffic is evaluated against a set of standards, and the NIPS uses the same standards as the NIDS. The best placement on the network is between a router, which hopefully has a firewall, and the destination network segment. The NIPS is programmed to make an active response to the situation. Some of those responses could include to block the offending IP address. It can close down the vulnerable interface. In some cases, it may terminate the network session. In more advanced systems, it may redirect the attack to a honeynet. There are additional actions that it can perform. It all depends upon how the NIPS is programmed. Then there's the Unified Threat Management Security Appliance, or the UTM security appliance. It is a possible all-in-one security solution. It may contain firewall features, it may contain IDS features, or intrusion detection system features. It can contain antivirus and anti-malware features. Your UTM may also have anti-spam features. It can perform content and URL filtering. So it all depends upon what kind of UTM that you purchase. You can get all of those features into one package, usually in the form of a network appliance. A network appliance is a specifically designed piece of hardware with an integrated software package, thus creating a closed system. The positive aspects of the UTM include that it provides multiple security features in a central location, which simplifies the management of security and eases updating that same security. A negative aspect is that it can concentrate security into a single system or location, which can create a single point of failure for both the network and for security. Now that concludes this session on the Introduction to Network Devices Part 2. I began by introducing the layered security concept, and I concluded with a brief discussion on some network devices. On behalf of PACE IT, thank you for watching this session, and I hope you watch another one soon. Hello, I'm Brian Farrell, and welcome to PACE IT's session on Introduction to Network Devices Part 3. Today I'm going to be talking about spam filters, and then we're going to conclude with a brief discussion on some network devices. And with that, let's go ahead and begin this session. Of course, I'm going to begin by talking about the spam filter. So what is spam? In most cases, spam is defined as unsolicited bulk email, or UBE, or sometimes it's called junk mail. The spammer, that's the person who is sending the spam, is hoping that the recipient will buy a product or service. While in most cases the receiving of spam isn't a security threat in itself, it is considered a waste of resources, which in a way is a security threat. There are various filters that are available for spam. These can be put in place, usually on an SMTP server, to reduce the amount of spam that is received by the end users. These filters include the real-time blacklist, or RBL. This is a subscription service that provides a list of known IP addresses of spam hosts, which then allows them to be blocked from reaching the SMTP server. Then there is the connection filter, which is prohibiting a list of specific IP addresses from connecting to an SMTP server. There are also recipient filters. This is blocking messages sent to a particular recipient or end user. There are also sender filters. This is blocking messages sent from a particular entity. And finally, there is the sender ID filter. This allows an SMTP server to review the sender policy framework, or SPF record, of the sender in DNS. If the sending SMTP server is listed, the message is accepted. It's not counted as spam. The first known instance of spam occurred in 1978 and involved an advertisement for Digital Equipment Corporation, that's DEC, computers. While the reaction from this spam was largely negative, it did result in some sales, and guess what? The spam industry was born. When the term spam became associated with unsolicited bulk email is unknown, but we can blame Monty Python's Flying Circus for the term spam. In 1970, they aired a skit in which the word spam keeps getting used. As a matter of fact, it's used in a song, and it effectively blocked useful communication. That's how a lot of people feel about spam. Not that it's necessarily harmful, but that it can hinder useful communication. Now let's move on to a brief discussion of some network devices. First up is the Web Security Gateway. It's a system designed to protect networks from malicious content that is on the internet. It can be used to filter out prohibited content. It can also be used to scan for malicious code. In some cases, these systems can also be used as a data loss prevention measure. In these cases, all outgoing content is scanned. If sensitive content is discovered in the scan, it's not allowed to leave the network. This helps entities to keep their secrets within their own networks. Not really a device on its own, but we need to discuss it anyways, is the protocol analyzer. It's often called a packet sniffer. It examines the network behavior at a very basic level. They allow the examination of the individual packets of data that are flowing on the network. They can be used to see what is consuming network resources, as in, is a broadcast storm occurring or is an interface going bad? Protocol analyzers can help to identify that. They can also be used to identify a network breach or attack. Protocol analyzers can also be used to study the methods that were used to create a network breach. Wireshark is a common protocol analyzer that is often used, and better yet, it's free. The Web Application Firewall is an application layer, or Layer 7, firewall that is used to control HTTP traffic that is allowed to reach the web server. This allows for greater inspection and control of messages and traffic that is destined to a network's web servers. They are configured to protect the servers from common attacks. They differ from normal network firewalls in that they are only concerned about what is attempting to reach the web server. Network firewalls, on the other hand, attempt to protect the network as a whole, which means that the Web Application Firewall is much more specialized and allows for more granular control. Now that concludes this session on the Introduction to Network Devices Part 3. I began by talking about the spam filter, and I concluded with a brief discussion on some network devices. On behalf of PACE IT, thank you for watching this session, and I hope to do another one soon. Good day, I'm Brian Farrell, and welcome to PACE IT's session on Secure Network Administration Concepts. Today I'm going to be talking about rule-based management, and then we're going to conclude with some additional secure network administration concepts. I have a fair amount of ground to cover, not a whole lot of time, so let's go ahead and begin this session. First up is rule-based management. So let's begin this by defining rule-based management. It's the implementation of rules at the technology level which are used to create a secure network environment. Rule-based management should be designed and tested to ensure that the rules function as expected. There's nothing worse than implementing a rule and then not having it behave as it was supposed to. Firewall rules fall under rule-based management. The firewall rules should be configured in such a way that only the required traffic is allowed to pass through the router. Whenever possible, the default rule should be to deny traffic. Once that default rule is in place, exceptions are then created that allow the required traffic to pass through the router. The last rule on any firewall should be an implicit deny statement. That means that unless explicitly allowed, the traffic is denied entry into the network. The access control list is another part of rule-based management. Now, the ACL should be implemented wherever possible. Firewall rules are also often called ACLs. Files and folders can have ACLs placed on them through the use of permissions. As a general rule, routers can have 2 ACLs per network interface. One ACL is on the inbound side of the interface, the other ACL is on the outbound side of the interface. And the 2 ACLs don't have to have the same rules. All ACLs should end with an implicit deny statement. As I said earlier, an implicit deny statement means that if it's not explicitly allowed in the ACL, the traffic or request is denied. Once created, the ACL should be tested thoroughly for functionality. That's to ensure that the required actions are allowed and to ensure that non-required actions are not allowed. Now let's move on to some additional secure network administration concepts. Now these concepts are pretty basic, but they're still important, and the first one is secure router configuration. That's locking the front door to your network. Put active ACLs in place. Disable default usernames and passwords. Require passwords for all access to the router, and whenever possible, use only secure protocols to access the router. Then there's port security on switches. This is locking a back door to the network. Enable security on all switch ports. This limits the ability of an attacker to gain access through an open switch port. MAC filtering is the security method that is most commonly used to secure switch ports. Then there's network separation. This is putting your eggs in more than one basket. Separate and group network resources by function and security needs. This can create more secure areas within a network. Network separation can be achieved through VLAN and VLAN management. Talking about VLAN management, this is keeping the fox out of the henhouse. First off, you should change the default management VLAN configuration. Whenever there's a default in place, you need to change it. Proper VLAN management keeps network traffic where it belongs. To allow inter-VLAN communication, the traffic has to pass through a router. So we go back to that secure router configuration. Then there are flood guards. This is blocking the most common of attacks. The most common network attack is still the denial of service or DOS attack. The attacker tries to flood the network with traffic to block legitimate traffic. But flood guards can recognize the pattern and halt the attack before the damage is done. Then there's loop protection. This is preventing unnecessary network traffic. Redundant routes can create routing loops. Routers use a time to live value and split horizon to combat routing loops. Redundant links on switches can also create loops within a switch network. Spanning Tree Protocol, that's STP, will negate these loops from ever occurring. If possible, you should implement 802.1x. This helps you to know exactly who has access to your networks. 802.1x is an authentication protocol used on wired and wireless networks. It requires users to authenticate, that is, prove who they are, against a central database before access to the network is granted. 802.1x is a good way to keep your network safe from nefarious users. You might want to consider Unified Threat Management. This is multiple security measures in one device. Unified Threat Management is a possible all-in-one security solution. UTM systems provide multiple security functions in a single network appliance. Just be aware that a UTM system may also create a single point of failure for your network. And finally, there's log analysis. This is knowing what is happening on your network all the time. Security, system, and application logs should be reviewed on a regular basis. All too often, they are only reviewed after a problem has occurred, when the signs of the problem were present in the log files before any damage had occurred. While reviewing log files may not be fun, they can help to prevent a problem from occurring in the first place. Now that concludes this session on secure network administration concepts. I began by talking about rule-based management, and then I concluded with some additional secure network administration concepts. On behalf of PACE IT, thank you for watching this session, and I hope to do another one soon. Hello, I'm Brian Farrell, and welcome to PACE IT's session on cloud concepts. Today we're going to be discussing cloud classifications, and then we're going to conclude by talking about types of cloud computing. I have a ton of information to impart, not a whole lot of time, so let's go ahead and begin this session. Of course, I'm going to begin with cloud classifications. Cloud computing is where the resources on the network are not actually physical in nature, they are provided to the user virtually. This can lead to a very fluid and dynamic environment, as required resources are normally only provisioned as needed and they are decommissioned once their use is completed. Most often, these virtual resources are not owned by the company that uses them, but are provided by a cloud service provider. While cloud computing is highly configurable and changeable, it does have some basic structures that are used in the classification of the type of cloud that is in use. There are 4 basic cloud classifications. There is the public cloud. This is where systems can interact with services and devices within the public cloud and on public networks, as in the internet, and possibly other public clouds. Amazon's AWS is an example of a public cloud. Then there are private clouds. This is where systems only communicate with services and devices within the specified private cloud. Private clouds are not open for the general public to purchase services. Then there are hybrid clouds. This combines aspects of both the public and private clouds. And finally, there is the community cloud classification. This is where cloud services are used by private individuals, organizations, or groups that have a common interest. And the community is responsible for what occurs within that cloud. Now let's discuss types of cloud computing. Because of the nature of cloud computing, it is very configurable to the needs and desires of the purchasers. Purchasers have many options beyond just the type of cloud service, as in public or private, that they want to provision. They may also determine what type of services they are going to require, from the most basic to the highly complex. So what types of cloud computing are there? Well, there's software as a service, or SaaS. The end user purchases the rights to use an application, think piece of software, without the need to configure the virtual servers that will deliver the application. Software as a service is usually delivered as a web application. It's opened and used from within a web browser. Then there is Platform as a Service, or PaaS. The user is provided with a development platform for the creation of software packages without the need to configure the virtual servers and infrastructure that delivers that development platform. And finally, there's Infrastructure as a Service, or IaaS. The end user is provided with access to virtual servers, which are configurable by the customer, and other virtual network resources. This creates a highly configurable environment in which customers can create the resources and performance that they require. In this situation, the end user supplies the software that is going to be used in the Infrastructure as a Service network, or they purchase additional SaaS applications. It is not uncommon for the type of cloud computing being used by an organization to be a mix of different types. Some departments may use IaaS, while a development team only utilizes a PaaS. Part of the advantage of cloud computing is only initializing resources as they are needed. In a private cloud situation, it is possible for the organization that is using it to actually own the cloud resources. If they do own the cloud resources, they may have it on their own site, or they may pay to have the resources hosted off-site. Cloud computing can be a great method of conserving company resources, but it also has several security considerations. When using hosting services, there is always the need to consider confidentiality. When the resources are out of the physical control of the company, it may be difficult to control access to those resources. In some situations, such as when a law requires a company to maintain physical control of the resources, cloud computing may be unacceptable. In addition to the physical control, there is also the problem of reliability and availability. The purchaser is having to rely upon the hosting service's ability to maintain system uptime and availability. Always perform due diligence research to ensure that the cloud provider is both reputable and reliable. As part of the research, it is also important to evaluate whether or not the resource is appropriate to be hosted. In some cases, you may find that it's not appropriate. Now that concludes this session on cloud concepts. I began by talking about cloud classifications, and then I concluded with a discussion on types of cloud computing. On behalf of PACE IT, thank you for watching this session, and I hope you watch another one soon. Hello, I'm Brian Farrell, and welcome to PACE IT's session on secure network design elements and components. Today I'm going to be talking about defense in depth, and then I'm going to move on to elements and components of network design. I have a fair amount of ground to cover, not a whole lot of time, so let's go ahead and dive into this session. We're going to begin by talking about defense in depth. Due to the complexity of modern networks, malicious attackers have multiple avenues that they can use to breach network security. This same complexity, though, also allows for security to be placed in multiple areas using different methods. By placing security at different levels and in different places, network administrators can increase the overall security posture of the network. This concept is known as defense in depth, or security in depth. Security should not just be placed on a single spot, as this creates a single point of failure, which should be avoided at all costs. Security should be in place at multiple layers of the network using a diversity of methods in order to create an effectively hardened network. Just as when peeling an onion, once a layer of security is stripped away, the attacker should find another layer waiting underneath. By using defense in depth, you should be able to create a highly hardened and secure network. With that out of the way, let's talk about elements and components of network design. First up is the demilitarized zone, or DMZ. The DMZ is a specific area, think zone, that is created, usually between two firewalls, that allows outside access to internal network resources, as in access to a web server, while the internal network remains protected from that same outside traffic. The external facing router allows specific outside traffic into the DMZ, while the internal router prevents that same outside traffic from entering the internal network, keeping it safe and secure. Another design element is network address translation, or NAT. NAT is a technique used to allow private IP addresses to be routed across or through an untrusted public network. The NAT device, which is usually a router, assigns a public routable IP address to a device that is requesting outside access. NAT has the added benefit of protecting the internal private network. Why is that? The private network's IP addressing scheme is hidden from untrusted networks by the NAT-enabled router, thus making it harder for a hacker to gain access to internal network resources. Now let's talk about NAC, Network Access Control. NAC is a method of controlling who and what gains access to a wired or wireless network. In most cases, NAC uses a combination of credentials-based security and some form of posture assessment for a device attempting to log onto the network. A posture assessment considers the state of the requesting device. The device must meet a set minimum standard before it is allowed access to the network. Common device assessments include the type of device, the operating system, the patch level of the operating system, the presence of anti-malware software, and how up-to-date that anti-malware software is. Then we have virtualization. Virtualization is the process of creating virtual resources instead of actual physical resources. Hardware, operating systems, and complete networks can be virtualized. A security advantage to virtualization is that if the virtual resource is compromised, it can be easily taken down, recovered, fixed, and then brought back online in very short order. Although I would recommend figuring out how it got compromised and filling that security hole. Subnetting is the logical division of a network. That's a single block of IP addresses being divided into discrete separate networks. This can be done to match the physical structure of the network, as in if your network only requires enough addresses for 100 nodes and it doesn't need all 254 nodes of a Class C address. Subnetting can also be done to increase the security of the network by segmenting resources by need and security level. Since I just brought up segmenting of resources, let's talk about that a little bit more. Security can be increased by segmenting a network based on resources and security needs through the implementation of virtual local area networks, or VLANs. The segmentation can be done based on user groups, as in a VLAN for the sales department and another VLAN for human resources. The segmentation can be done based on resource type, as in a VLAN for file servers and another VLAN for web servers. Commonly, segmentation of resources is accomplished with a combination of both user groups and resource type. The use of VLANs supports a more secure, layered approach in the network design. In modern networks, it is not uncommon to need to allow remote access to local network resources. Remote workers often need to access resources that are located on the main business network. This requires the use of remote access technology in order for it to happen in a secure manner. Remote access can occur using telephony technology, as in using a dial-up VPN, or through the use of a different type of virtual private network. In all cases, secure protocols and methods should be used in order to ensure the security of the local network. For example, one of the forms of extensible authentication protocol, EAP, should be used when allowing remote access. Now that concludes this session on secure network design elements and components. Today we talked about defense in depth, and then we concluded by discussing some elements and components of network design. On behalf of PACE IT, thank you for watching this session, and I hope to do another one soon. Good day, I'm Brian Farrell, and welcome to PACE IT's session on Common Network Protocols, Part 1. Today we're going to be talking about IPv4 and IPv6, and then we're going to conclude with network storage protocols. There's a fair amount of ground to cover, so let's go ahead and begin this session. Of course, I'm going to begin by talking about IPv4 and IPv6. With Internet protocols, IPv4 still has dominance over IPv6 in the network. This will change, and it is already beginning to do so. Both IPv4 and IPv6 operate at layer 3, the network layer, of the OSI model. Both IPv4 and IPv6 operate at the Internet layer of the TCP/IP reference model. The protocols are similar in function and yet are different in how they provide those functions. Both protocols are responsible for network addressing and routing operations within a network or networks. While IPv4 has performed these duties adequately for many years, IPv6 is slowly assuming those responsibilities and will eventually be the dominant protocol. As a matter of fact, most of the world is now out of routable IPv4 addresses, which means that the switch to IPv6 is already starting to occur. So let's do an overview of both IPv4 and IPv6. And we're going to start with IPv4. It's a 32-bit addressing scheme that provides over 4 billion possible unique network addresses. It's commonly represented in a dotted decimal format. The numbers are separated by decimals. Each unit represents 8 bits or 1 byte. IPv4 can use different methods of transmitting data through the networks. It can use unicast, which is one-to-one communication. It can use multicast, which is one-to-a-few communication, or it can use broadcast transmissions, which is one-to-many communication. IPv6, on the other hand, is a 128-bit addressing scheme that provides over 340 undecacillion possible unique addresses. That is a lot of addresses. It's commonly represented in a comma-separated hexadecimal format. Each set contains 2 bytes, which is equal to 16 bits, and each set is separated from the others by a colon. Like IPv4, IPv6 uses unicast and multicast transmissions, but it does not use a broadcast type transmission. It does use anycast transmission, which is one to the closest communications, as one of its means of replacing the broadcast transmission. With that done, let's move on to network storage protocols. Before we move on to the protocols, let's talk about the storage area network and the network attached storage. The storage area network, or SAN, and the network attached storage, the NAS, often get confused with one another, but they are actually very different. The SAN is an actual network of devices that have the sole purpose of storing data efficiently. The NAS is a specifically designed network appliance that has been configured to store data more efficiently than standard storage methods. They still kind of sound similar, but the difference is that the NAS is a data storage appliance that is placed on a network, while the SAN is a network of data storage devices. It's not uncommon for the storage area network to contain multiple network-attached storage devices. Now let's move on to the protocols. We're going to start with fiber channel. It's a high-speed network technology that was originally developed to operate over fiber optic cables only. The standards have been modified to allow the use of copper cabling in conjunction with the fiber optic cables. It's commonly used to connect storage area networks together. Fiber channel uses Fiber Channel Protocol, or FCP, as its transport layer protocol, or its layer 4 protocol, to transmit SCSI, that's Small Computer System Interface, commands to storage devices, as in it uses FCP to transmit SCSI commands to network-attached storage appliances. Then we have FC over Ethernet, or FCOE. It's a layer 2 protocol used to transmit FC commands over an Ethernet network. As a layer 2 protocol, FCOE is non-routable. And finally, we have Internet SCSI, or iSCSI. It's an IP-based network standard used to connect data storage facilities and storage-attached networks. It is a layer 3 protocol. It allows SCSI commands and processes to take place over long distance, as iSCSI is a routable protocol. And that concludes this session on Common Network Protocols, Part 1. I talked about IPv4 and IPv6, and then I had a brief discussion on network storage protocols. On behalf of PACE IT, thank you for watching this session, and I hope you watch another one soon. Hello, I'm Brian Farrell, and welcome to PACE IT's session on Common Network Protocols, Part 2. Today we're going to be discussing the difference between ports and protocols, and then we're going to conclude with a discussion on some common protocols. With that, let's go ahead and begin this session. We're going to begin by discussing the difference between ports and protocols. And we're going to start with ports. Ports are a method of specifying what protocols and services to access. Many protocols and services use default ports so that they are easy to locate. There are 65,536 ports available to be used for communication. But port 0 is a reserved port. So in actuality, only ports 1 through 65,535 are available to be used. The first 1,024 ports are specifically assigned and are called well-known ports. These are assigned by the IANA, and if you would like to know more about those well-known ports, you can go to www.iana.org and look for assignments/port numbers. Ports can be thought of as a phone number extension. The IP address is the main number that you are trying to reach. The port number is the extension, think service or protocol, that you want to access. Now let's discuss protocols. Protocols can be thought of as the language that two applications on either side of the connection agree to speak. Protocols translate requests into services. Most protocols use predefined ports, but some protocols must be user configured, and some protocols don't have a designated port at all. With that done, let's move on to some common protocols. Let's start with HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. It's the primary protocol used to transfer data over the internet. It is assigned to port 80, and it can use either TCP or UDP as its transport protocol. Then there's HTTPS, which is Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure. It's the primary protocol to securely transfer data over the internet using either SSL or TLS technology. In actuality, SSL should no longer be used. You should only be using TLS, but that's another discussion. HTTPS is assigned to port 443, and it uses TCP as its transport protocol. Then there's NetBIOS, which is Network Basic Input-Output System. It was originally developed to allow hosts to be able to communicate with servers. It's assigned to ports 137 through 139, and it can use TCP or UDP as its transport protocol. Let's move on to SMTP, Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. It's the protocol that is used to transfer email from a client to an email server, and it is also used to transfer email between email servers. By default, it's assigned to port 25, and it can use TCP or UDP as its transfer protocol. Then we have POP3, Post Office Protocol version 3. This is the protocol used by clients to retrieve email from servers. Once engaged, POP3 downloads all the messages from the server. The user cannot access email messages until they have been downloaded and are on their local device. It is assigned to port 110 by default, and it uses TCP as its transport protocol. Internet Message Access Protocol, or IMAP, is a protocol that's also used by clients to access email on email servers. It allows the client to administer and organize email on the email server before it's downloaded. Many businesses and organizations use IMAP to replace POP3 for their email client needs. IMAP is assigned to port 143, and it uses TCP as its layer 4 transport protocol. Let's move on to SNMP, Simple Network Management Protocol. It's a protocol that's used to monitor and manage local area networks. It's assigned to port 161 and uses UDP by default. Then there's DNS, Domain Name System. This is the protocol that's used to map computer names to their IP addresses. It's assigned to port 53 by default, and it can use TCP or UDP as its transport layer protocol. Then we have ICMP, Internet Control Message Protocol. It's a messaging service for Internet Protocol. The ICMP packets are carried as encapsulated IP datagrams. ICMP also provides information about networking issues. ICMP is not assigned to a default port, but it is still a common protocol. Telnet is a protocol used for remote access to systems. It is unsecure, but it is a handy bidirectional terminal service. It's assigned to port 23 and uses TCP and UDP as its layer 4 protocol. Secure Shell, or SSH, is a protocol that's used to encrypt data traffic on networks. It can be used in place of Telnet to provide a secure bidirectional terminal connection, and it's assigned to port 22. And SSH uses TCP and UDP. I mentioned TLS earlier, that's Transport Layer Security. It's a cryptographic protocol used to encrypt online communications. It uses certificates and asymmetrical cryptography to authenticate hosts and exchange security keys. TLS is a better option than Secure Socket Layer, which functions in a similar manner. That concludes this session on Common Network Protocols, Part 2. Today I talked about the difference between ports and protocols, and then we concluded with a brief discussion on some common protocols. On behalf of PACE IT, thank you for watching this session, and I hope to do another one soon. Good day, I'm Brian Farrell, and welcome to PACE IT's session on Common Network Protocols, Part 3. Today we're going to discuss some common protocols, and then we're going to conclude with a brief discussion about end-to-end security. There's a fair amount of ground to cover, so let's go ahead and dive into this session. Of course, I'm going to begin by discussing some common protocols. First up is FTP, that's File Transfer Protocol. It's a standard protocol for transferring files between computing systems. It does require user authentication, but it does not offer encryption, so it is not very secure. It is assigned to port 20 and to port 21, and it uses TCP as its layer 4 protocol. Surprisingly, SFTP, which stands for Secure File Transfer Protocol, is more secure than FTP. It is a protocol for transferring files between computing systems. It does require user authentication and encryption by default. It's assigned to port 22 using TCP and UDP when SSH is used for the encryption. By default, it's assigned to port 990 when using TLS or SSL for encryption, and it still uses TCP and UDP as its layer 4 transport protocol. Then we have SCP, Secure Copy Protocol. It's a protocol for transferring files between computing systems, again, and it requires user authentication and offers encryption by default. It is assigned to port 22 and uses TCP and UDP as its layer 4 protocol. Then there is TFTP, Trivial File Transfer Protocol. It transfers files between servers and clients. No user authentication is required, and no encryption is in place. It's commonly used to upload and download network device configuration files. It's assigned to port 69 and uses TCP and UDP at layer 4 as its transport protocol. Then there is RDP, Remote Desktop Protocol. It's used in Microsoft networks by Remote Desktop Connection and Remote Assistance to make remote connections to desktop systems. It's assigned to port 3389 by default, and it also uses TCP and UDP at layer 4. Now let's briefly discuss end-to-end security. And we're going to do that by talking about IPsec, or Internet Protocol Security. It works at layer 3 and above of the OSI reference model. It's the most common suite of protocols used to secure a VPN connection. IPsec can be used with the Authentication Header, or AH protocol. AH only offers authentication services but not encryption. Or IPsec can be used with Encapsulating Security Payload, or ESP. ESP both authenticates and encrypts packets. It is the most popular method, but it does have more overhead than AH. Both Authentication Header Protocol and ESP will operate in one of two modes. The first mode is transport mode, which is commonly used between two devices, as in a host-to-host VPN. Or they can be used in tunnel mode, which is commonly used between two endpoints, as in a site-to-site VPN. IPsec implements Internet Security Association and Key Management by default, so it implements ISACAMP by default. ISACAMP provides a method for transferring security keys and authentication data between systems outside of the security key generating process. This is a much more secure process than other implementations. And there we have our brief discussion on end-to-end security. That concludes this session on Common Network Protocols Part 3. We started by discussing some common protocols and then ended with a brief discussion on end-to-end security. On behalf of PACE IT, thank you for watching this session, and I hope to do another one soon. Good day, I'm Brian Farrell, and welcome to PACE IT's session on wireless security considerations. Today we're going to be discussing some of the unique challenges of wireless networks, and then we're going to move on to security for wireless. There's a fair amount of ground to cover, not a whole lot of time, so let's go ahead and jump into this session. So let's talk about the unique challenge of wireless. Wireless networks can represent a special challenge in the network hardening process. One of the main tenets of network security is hiding your traffic. With wireless, it's impossible to hide your traffic because it flows over the airwaves. So with the proper equipment, anybody can see that traffic flowing on a wireless network. Also, end users will often install their own access points for convenience, allowing them to connect to the network wirelessly on their own. These rogue access points can create a vulnerability in the network as a whole. One method of combating these rogue access points is by conducting periodic site surveys. Using a combination of hardware and software, site surveys can help to locate rogue access points so they can be removed. Site surveys can also be used to ensure that wireless network signals are only present where they should be. The only wireless signals that should be present in any environment are those that are specifically authorized to be there. Now let's move on to security for wireless. First up is default username and passwords. All networking devices come with a default administrator username and password. A best practice is to change or disable the default administrator username and password when setting up the device. These defaults are well known and do represent a security vulnerability. Then there are the Service Set Identifier broadcasts, or the SSID broadcasts. A wireless access point will broadcast the names of available networks. By default, the SSID is broadcast in clear text, creating a vulnerability. A best practice is to set the WAP to hide the SSID beaconing. This will prevent the casual user from seeing the wireless network, but even with the beacon set to be hidden with the proper hardware and software, an attacker can still read those broadcasts. So that in itself will not stop a determined hacker. Then there's device placement. Wireless access points with omnidirectional antennas should be placed in the center of the desired coverage area. Omnidirectional antennas broadcast in all directions uniformly. So if you place it on the edge of where you want network coverage to occur, you're going to be placing your wireless signal where it shouldn't belong. Wireless access points with directional antennas can be placed toward the edge of the desired coverage area. Directional antennas broadcast in a specific direction only. Then there are power level controls. Most wireless access points come with the ability to adjust the power levels of the radio frequency signal. RF power levels should be set to reduce or increase the wireless coverage area to what is desired. All WAPs come with the ability to limit which layer 2 MAC addresses can connect to the wireless network. While this can increase the security of the wireless network, MAC addresses can be spoofed by an attacker. In addition to this, MAC filtering may not be appropriate in all situations, especially if there are a lot of wireless devices that come and go from the network, with new ones showing up all the time. In this case, MAC filtering is not the best option. A better option would be to enable encryption. So let's talk about encryption, and we're going to begin with WEP, which stands for Wired Equivalent Privacy. It's an older encryption standard that utilizes a pre-shared key to encrypt messages between the wireless access point and the connecting devices. WEP used the RC4 algorithm for the encryption. It is easily broken and should not be used. It can take an attacker just minutes to crack a WEP encrypted network. Better than WEP is WPA. That's Wireless Protected Access. It is also an older encryption standard, and it was used as an intermediate replacement for wired equivalent privacy encryption until a better standard could be brought online. WPA introduced TKIP, Temporal Key Integrity Protocol, as an additional security measure. TKIP creates a new security key for every packet that is sent across the wireless network. WPA can be broken and should not be used unless absolutely necessary. Better than WPA is WPA2 Personal. This is the current wireless encryption standard for the home or small business, and it utilizes a pre-shared key for encryption. WPA2 Personal introduced counter mode cipher block chaining message authentication code protocol with advanced encryption standard, so that would be CCMP with AES, as a means of addressing the weaknesses present in WEP and WPA. It cannot be easily cracked, but given enough time and computing resources, it can also be broken. But you can still consider it a secure encryption standard for the home or small office. Better yet, if you have the resources, you might want to implement WPA Enterprise. It is the current wireless encryption standard for larger businesses. Users are required to be authenticated before being allowed to connect to the wireless network. The authentication can occur using different methods that all fall within the 802.1x standard. The wireless access point will pass requests to log on to an authentication server, commonly a radius server, to authenticate the user before allowing access to the wireless network. Now let's talk about Extensible Authentication Protocol, or EAP. It's a common authentication protocol used by WPA2 to allow access to wireless networks. EAP packets are encapsulated within 802.1x packets, which are forwarded to an authentication server. There are different versions of EAP. There is LEAP, or Lightweight EAP, which is a Cisco proprietary method of implementing EAP. It was developed before 802.1x was standardized. Then there's PEEP, Protected EAP. It is a method of encapsulating EAP packets with transport layer security encryption in order to increase the security of the wireless transmission. There are some additional wireless network security measures that you can take. First up is the captive portal. Captive portals can be used to require users to authenticate through a web page when attempting to join a network. They're a common method used in publicly available wireless networks. You know, when you agree to the terms of service when you sign on to a public wireless network, that is a captive portal. Then there's VPN over wireless, which can be used to further increase wireless security. Wireless network access must be through a VPN. This adds an additional level of security in the network, as the VPN will implement IPsec as a means of end-to-end security. Now that concludes this session on wireless security considerations. We discussed the unique challenge of wireless, and then we concluded with security for wireless. On behalf of PACE IT, thank you for watching this session, and I hope to do another one soon. Hello, I'm Brian Farrell, and welcome to PACE IT's session on Risk-Related Concepts, Part 1. Today I'm going to be discussing control types, and then we're going to conclude with some policies for reducing risk. And with that, let's go ahead and begin this session. Of course, I'm going to begin by talking about control types. There are 3 different types of controls that can be put on network resources. The first one is management controls. These are any written policy, procedure, or guideline that is used to help secure network resources against attack or abuse. Management controls are often used to define and outline other control types. They are a very broad category of controls that can include security policies, hiring policies, security awareness training, etc., etc. Then there are technical controls. These are security measures that are used in controlling access to any particular resource that is available on the network. Technical controls can include physical controls used to limit physical access to networking equipment, as in locked server room doors. Some examples of technical controls beyond the locked server room doors include encryption, firewalls, passwords, etc. And then there are operational controls. These are the procedures that are put in place to help ensure that day-to-day operations can occur even after a risk event has happened. Some examples of operational controls include network redundancies, hot and cold site maintenance, and backup procedures. Now it's time to talk about policies for reducing risk. Any policy that is used to help secure the workplace and/or company data and networks is by default a security policy. Security policies document or outline what is allowed or not allowed to occur on the network from a security point of view. They are usually crafted at the upper layer of management with the help of knowledgeable IT personnel. In most cases, the network security policies are actually crafted by the IT personnel and then given to upper management to approve. Security policies give administrators the authority to put into place measures to protect the security of the network. In many cases, these security policies also give the administrators the authority to enforce the policies that lead to a hardened network. Now let's move on to some different policies. First up is the privacy policy. It's a policy that is used to educate employees and customers on information collection practices. Privacy policies will state why the information is collected, what information is collected, when it is collected, and how that information may be used. Many businesses now publish their privacy policies, and in some cases, privacy policies may be regulated. Then there is the Acceptable Use Policy, or AUP. It's a policy that documents what a company considers to be acceptable use of its IT assets. It may contain several sub-policies within the general AUP. The AUP should cover what is acceptable use of the internet, email, company laptops, and mobile devices. While outside threats may be difficult to deal with, the inside threat may be more dangerous to a network. It has been estimated that up to 80% of all data breaches can be traced back to a failure of security measures from within the network itself. Sometimes the breaches occur by mistake, but all too often, these breaches are intentional. This implies that the greatest security threats are the people that already have been given access to the network. Policies and procedures can be put in place to reduce the risks that are associated with internal employees. Some of these policies include a least privilege policy. This is where administrators only grant the minimum amount of network privileges or access to network resources that are required to get the job done. This helps to minimize risk when an account gets compromised or in the case of a malicious network user. Then there's a separation of duties policy. Critical jobs are separated into different tasks with users only authorized to perform one of those tasks of the critical job. This helps to minimize the damage that can occur from fraudulent employee activities, as it would require more than one employee to take part in those fraudulent activities in order for it to be a success, and it's a whole lot harder for fraud to take place when there's more than one person involved. Then there are mandatory vacation policies. All employees should be required to take vacations, especially if they handle a critical task. This can lead to a reduction in the threat level from fraudulent employee actions. Employees know that someone else will be performing their duties in their absence and may discover any irregularities. And finally, there's job rotation. Mandatory job rotation requires that employees change job duties on a regular basis. This can lead to a reduction in the risk of fraudulent activities and has the added benefit of cross-training employees, especially for those critical tasks. Now that concludes this session on risk-related concepts, part 1. I began by talking about the different control types, and then I concluded with some policies for reducing risk. On behalf of PACE IT, thank you for watching this session, and I hope to do another one soon. Good day, I'm Brian Farrell, and welcome to PACE IT's session on Risk-Related Concepts, Part 2. Today I'm going to be talking about qualitative versus quantitative risk assessments, and then I'm going to talk about some other risk calculation factors. There's a fair amount of ground to cover, so let's go ahead and begin this session. Let's begin by talking about qualitative versus quantitative risk assessments. Many businesses dedicate a fair amount of their resources, both in time and in money, to perform risk assessments. In most cases, these risk assessments may be broken into one of two main categories. They may be either qualitative or quantitative assessments. Qualitative assessments are conducted based on the probability or likelihood of the risk occurring and the expected impact on the business. This type of assessment is not really concerned about the actual dollar impact, just about the likelihood that it's going to occur. Quantitative assessments, on the other hand, are conducted based on the projected cost in dollars if a risk event occurs. Now let's go into a little bit more detail. The basic formula for a qualitative assessment is the risk is equal to the probability times the loss, or the likelihood times the impact. Now, to create this assessment, several tables are built using the variables of the formulas. A risk table outlines the possible events, as in a data breach or hard drive failure. Then a probability or likelihood table outlines the possibility of the event occurring, as in not likely, likely, or most likely, with the value assigned to the likelihood. And then there's a loss or impact table. This outlines the impact to the business if the event occurs. Is the impact minor, medium, or major, with a value assigned to the loss? These tables are used collectively to create a qualitative risk assessment. When evaluating risks, quite often qualitative assessments are done first, and they're used to determine which assets and risks require a quantitative risk assessment. That's because quantitative risk assessments take more time, effort, and usually money. So let's talk about the quantitative assessment. It involves using the actual cost of a threat event to help determine how much to spend on preventative measures. You know, it doesn't make sense to spend more to prevent a risk from occurring than the risk is actually going to cost the business. Quantitative risk assessments can help when budgeting for a security solution to reduce the risk of occurrence. The first step is to determine the value of the asset. Now, this value may be the cost to replace the asset or the cost of downtime. It all depends upon what risk you're evaluating. The second step is to determine the exposure factor. This is the cost of a threat event expressed as a percentage of the value of the asset. Step 3 is to determine the single loss expectancy, or the SLE. The SLE is equal to the value of the asset as determined in step 1 times the exposure factor, or EF, as determined in step 2. Once you have the SLE, then you go on to step 4. Step 4 is to determine what the average rate of occurrence is. That's the number of times the threat event is estimated to occur each year. Once you have the average rate of occurrence, then you can determine step 5, which is to find the average loss expectancy, or the ALE. The ALE is the SLE times the ARO, or the single loss expectancy times the average rate of occurrence. What this gives you is the dollar amount that your security solution should fall below. So that's step 6. You need to determine which security solution that falls below the ALE will mitigate the risk of occurrence. With that done, let's move on to other risk calculation factors. Now, these are factors that may come into play when determining some of the figures that are used in the quantitative risk assessment. First up, we have the MTTF, the mean time to fail. This is the average time a device is expected to be operational in production before it fails. This is usually reported by the manufacturer, and it is a non-recoverable occurrence. That means when the MTTF hits, that asset is gone. Then there's the MTBF, the mean time between failures. This is the average time between failures of a system or device. Then we have the mean time to restore or recover. That's the MTTR. This is the average time required to restore or recover when a failure occurs. Then there's the RTO, which is the recovery time objective. This is the amount of allowable time a system or device can be down, and it can be measured in hours or minutes or even days. And finally, we have the RPO, the recovery point objective. This represents the portion of the system that is expected to be recovered after a failure. As in, the RPO may be that it's expected that you will be able to recover everything from the point of the last full backup or maybe from the last incremental backup. That concludes this session on risk-related concepts, part 2. I talked about qualitative versus quantitative risk assessments, and then I briefly discussed some other risk calculation factors. On behalf of PACE IT, thank you for watching this session, and I hope to do another one soon. Hello, I'm Brian Farrell, and welcome to PACE IT's session on Risk-Related Concepts, Part 3. Today I'm going to be talking about treatment of risk, cloud computing and virtualization risks, and then some other risk terms and concepts. I have a fair amount of ground to cover, not a whole lot of time, so let's go ahead and begin this session. Of course, I'm going to begin by talking about treatment of risk. Now, the treatment of risk is actually our approach to handling risk. Once a risk has been identified, there are 5 main approaches to dealing with it. There's mitigation. This is the implementation of some type of control, as in an administrative or technical control, to reduce either the probability of a risk occurring or the severity of the event if it does occur. Then there's acceptance. That's taking no action to either reduce the probability of the event occurring or the severity of the event if it does occur. This is deciding that the impact of the risk does not justify the expenditure of resources to get rid of the risk. Then there's transference. This is making the risk another entity's issue. It's usually done through the purchase of insurance. And then we have avoidance. This is where, after identifying a risk, it's determining to avoid pursuing any action that may lead to the risk event occurring. While risk can be avoided, this may mean the loss of a business opportunity. And finally, there's deterrence. An attempt is made to deter the risk from occurring, usually through the use of potential punishment, as in termination of employment or prosecution. Deterrence is one of the least common approaches to dealing with risk. Now let's move on to cloud computing and virtualization risks. Cloud computing can create benefits to a business. IT needs, including data storage, can be offloaded to another entity, thus reducing a business's cost. While this may be beneficial, careful thought must go into the decision-making process. This includes a thorough analysis of the risks that may be present. A review of the provider's security is in order before any business should place crucial data on a cloud provider's system. The reliability of the provider's system should also be evaluated to ensure that availability meets the business's requirements. Additionally, in some cases, data and applications cannot reside on a hosted system because this may violate regulations. Always do your due diligence before engaging in cloud computing and virtualization. This will allow you to mitigate the risks that may be involved. And now let's conclude with some other risk terms and concepts. First up is asset. It's any resource that a business needs in order to function. And it can be anything from as minor as a pen or pencil to as major as a metropolitan area network. Then we have the false positive. This is when an application or system implemented for security warns of a threat that is not actually present. It is common for anti-malware applications to block legitimate applications from executing due to a false positive. In these situations, it may be necessary to train that anti-malware application to allow that other software package to execute. Then there's the false negative. This is when an application or system implemented for security fails to warn of a risk that is actually present. While false positives may be an annoyance, false negatives are dangerous. The situation presents a risk in itself. The failure to warn or block an actual risk allows that risk to occur. Then there's vulnerability. In this situation, it's a weakness in the configuration of software or hardware. Then there's threat. It's an event that can cause harm or reduce the value of an asset. Then there's the threat target. It's a system or device that is the object of a threat event. Then there's the threat vector. It's the mechanism, tool, or path used to exploit a weakness in networks, systems, or software. And finally, we have the threat actor. This is the person or entity utilizing the threat vector to exploit a weakness. That concludes this session on Risk-Related Concepts, Part 3. I began by talking about treatment of risk, and then I moved on to cloud computing and virtualization risks, and then I concluded with a brief discussion on other risk terms and concepts. On behalf of PACE IT, thank you for watching this session, and I hope you watch another one soon. Good day, I'm Brian Farrell, and welcome to PACE IT's session on integrating data and systems with third parties. Today I'm going to talk about evaluating the risks of integration, and then I'm going to conclude with some considerations of integration of data. I have a fair amount of ground to cover, so let's go ahead and begin this session. Of course, I'm going to begin by talking about the need to evaluate the risks of integration. There are multiple reasons why systems and data may be integrated with third parties. The real key is to know the risks associated with that integration. Systems and data may be required to be integrated because of a joint venture with another entity, or when implementing a cloud computing solution, there will be a need to integrate systems and data. In some cases, the need for integration is well known and intentional, while in other cases, it may not even be recognized as happening. When people are using social media, they may actually be integrating company data with a third party. In all cases, there are risks associated with the integration of systems and data with third parties. Now let's discuss some of the considerations of integration. First up is risk awareness. Always evaluate the risks when thinking about integrating systems and data with a third party. So what are some of those risks? Well, the data may reside outside of the control of the business. The network transmissions may be vulnerable. The other side of the integration may not be as secure as your side. And finally, that third party may go out of business. What happens then? Those are some of the risks that you need to be aware of. The onboarding and offboarding of business partners is another consideration. Procedures and systems need to be put in place that will allow authorized people from the third-party business partner to access the appropriate systems and data within your network. This is the onboarding process. Implementing an identity and access management system, or IAM system, can help ease the burden. Procedures and systems also need to be put in place to remove access once the partnership is terminated or the authorized person leaves the business partner. This is the offboarding process. Then you need to consider the interoperability agreements. If the risks of integration are deemed acceptable, some additional agreements should be created to help the process along. There should be a memorandum of understanding. This is a document that is created that establishes an agreement between two parties. Another document that might be needed is a blanket purchase agreement. It's a document that is created and used to cover repetitive needs for products or services. There should be a service level agreement, or SLA. It's an agreement that specifies the guaranteed uptime of a system. And finally, there may be the need for an internet service agreement. This specifies any data limits placed on an internet connection and should also contain a guarantee of the amount of uptime of that internet connection. Another consideration of integration is data backups. Cloud storage of data backups may be the best solution to offsite storage for the backups, mitigating the risk of data loss in the case of a disaster because it won't be on your site. But there is a risk associated with this because that backup of your data is no longer in your possession. To mitigate this risk, all backups that are stored with a third party should be encrypted. Then there's data ownership. There needs to be a clear understanding of data ownership before the integration of systems and data is undertaken. Some third parties consider all data stored on their systems as being their data, no matter where that data originated from. Then there's compliance and performance standards. Read all agreements with third parties carefully to ensure that what they offer and/or provide meets with the compliance and standards that are required. In some cases, it is not only inappropriate to integrate data with a third party, it may actually be in violation of the law. Always follow security policies and procedures. In all cases of systems and data integration, security policies and procedures should be in place to protect the integrity of the business's systems. At least one of the policies needs to define what is considered to be unauthorized sharing of data. And this moves us to a consideration of social media. Social media represents a type of data integration that may be difficult to control. With the increased use of social media networks and applications, company data may not necessarily be under the control of the proper entities. Companies should strive to train personnel on what is appropriate to share on social media and what should not be placed out in the open. It is possible for sensitive company information to be placed on the internet through the use of social media. That concludes this session on integrating data and systems with third parties. I began by talking about the need to evaluate the risks of integration, and then I concluded with some considerations of integration. On behalf of PACE IT, thank you for watching this session, and I hope to do another one soon. Good day, I'm Brian Farrell, and welcome to PACE IT's session on risk mitigation strategies. Today I'm going to cover the why of taking risks, and then I'm going to talk about some strategies for mitigating risks. There's a fair amount of ground to cover, so let's go ahead and begin this session. Of course, I'm going to begin with the why of taking risks. It seems to be a law of nature, inflexible and inexorable, that those who will not risk cannot win. And that's by John Paul Jones. And it neatly sums up the why of risk taking. In the marketplace, there is no reward without taking on the risk of failure. This brings up an interesting quandary. Investors will often reward risk by increasing the value of a company. On the other hand, failure due to risk-taking often leads to changes in management. This leads to a situation where management can be both rewarded and punished for taking on risk. This makes management very uneasy. So management will often take on risk to gain the rewards while at the same time implementing strategies to mitigate the amount of risk that it is willing to assume. With the why covered, now let's talk about strategies for mitigating risk. First up is change management. All change represents a risk to systems. A small change in one system may have a ripple effect that multiplies through the whole system. Change management is implemented in order to evaluate changes for their effects on the system as a whole, which can bring to light some hidden risks associated with a change. Change management allows for changes to occur while at the same time mitigating the risks associated with those changes. Then there's review of user rights and user permissions. Users must be granted rights and permissions in order to function in their positions. These rights and permissions may, in fact, represent a security risk. Periodic reviews should be conducted on user rights and permissions to ensure that the principle of least privilege is being followed, thus mitigating risk. Periodic reviews should also be conducted on user rights and permissions to ensure that all unnecessary user accounts are removed from the system, also mitigating risk. Another strategy is to perform routine audits. Audits are reviews of systems that should be conducted on a regular basis in order to reduce risks. Security audits can be conducted on many different systems to evaluate different aspects of risk, including system configurations and vulnerability assessments. Then there's incident management. It's a type of after-the-fact mitigation technique. After a security incident has occurred, effective incident management can help to contain the damage. In addition to that, effective incident management can help to prevent that security incident from occurring again. Then there's the enforcement of policies and procedures. Effective policies and procedures can reduce the chances of a risk event from ever taking place. But this relies upon the proper enforcement of those policies and procedures to help prevent that risk event from occurring. Data loss prevention systems can be implemented as a type of technology control to mitigate the risk of loss or theft of data. DLP systems can be a software application or a network appliance. They are designed to analyze information traversing the network to help ensure that sensitive data remains contained inside the established safe boundaries. DLP systems can monitor network links and review what is being transmitted through protocols associated with instant messaging, email, FTP, HTTP. DLP systems may also be configured to scan storage systems to help ensure that data is being stored in the proper location. That concludes this session on risk mitigation strategies. I began by talking about the why of taking risks, and then I concluded with a brief discussion on some strategies for mitigating risks. On behalf of PACE IT, thank you for watching this session, and I hope you watch another one soon. Good day, I'm Brian Farrell, and welcome to PACE IT's session on basic forensic procedures. Today we're going to be discussing how to recognize the need for forensic procedures, and then we will conclude with some basic forensic concepts and procedures. There's a fair amount of ground to cover, so let's go ahead and begin this session. Of course, I'm going to begin by discussing how to recognize the need for forensic procedures. The first step in basic forensic is the recognition that forensic measures need to be taken, as in that a security incident has occurred. Most technicians, at least hopefully, will not need to deal with a murder mystery in the workplace. However, it is almost a certainty that they will have to deal with some type of security or legal issue, especially when supporting an organization's network. This will often require using a first response that includes forensic procedures. The response to security and legal issues needs to be done in a manner such that evidence is recorded and preserved. The first step is recognizing that something has occurred which needs to be documented and that evidence needs to be collected and preserved. With that, let's discuss some basic forensic concepts and procedures. Let's begin by discussing first responder responsibilities. The first item on any first responder's agenda is to secure the area and limit who has access to the area as much as possible. Do not power down computer systems at this time. Securing the area and limiting access is done to protect possible evidence from being contaminated. Document anyone who has access to the area after it has been secured. If necessary, at least to stop an ongoing computer attack, it is permissible to unplug the network cable. First responders need to document the scene thoroughly, including what is on any computer monitors. Video capture can be used to document the scene. Polaroid-type pictures, not digital pictures, work well as evidence. It may also be necessary to diagram the area. The first responders should interview any witnesses as soon as possible. And finally, the first responders need to start the electronic evidence collection process by order of volatility. So let's discuss the order of evidence volatility. Electronic evidence is volatile and easily corruptible just because of what it is. So the order of collection is vital. And the collection process needs to be done from most volatile to least volatile. The most volatile of all electronic evidence is the contents of memory or the contents of RAM. There is software out there that will allow a first responder to dump the contents of RAM into a secure file to be collected as evidence. Next up are swap files. They're not as volatile as random access memory, but they're still very temporary in nature. Next up is network processes. All network processes that are active on the affected system or systems need to be recorded. And then the same needs to occur with system processes. Then there's file system information. This needs to be collected, including the attributes of all files. And finally, raw disk blocks. This is all of the contents on all of the disk drives of all of the affected systems. After isolating the affected system or systems from the network, a bit level image of the system needs to be created. When creating the bit level image, it is necessary to create the proper timestamps. Have the recording system match the time offset of the target system. It is necessary to create 2 copies of the bit level image and to create a message digest of those images. This is to be able to prove later that the images have not been tampered with. One of the images should be securely stored and kept as evidence. The other image can be examined in detail. So there are 2 different types of system image. You can do a live system image or a static system image. With a live system image, this is capturing the system image before the system is powered down. This can be used to capture highly volatile evidence. There is a warning though, a live system image may change the target system's data structure, which will result in a change in the evidence. A static system image, on the other hand, is capturing a bit-level system image after the system is powered down. The hard drive or drives are removed from the system and connected to a forensic workstation with a write blocker placed between them. The write blocker prevents any changes from occurring on the target drive as its image is captured. All evidence requires a chain of custody. It's a document that identifies who collected the evidence, when it was collected, and who has had access to it since it was collected. A proper chain of custody document can prove that evidence has been accurately preserved, and the chain of custody can also be considered as part of the evidence. A chain of custody document will help to ensure that all evidence is admissible in court. A broken chain of custody will negate the collected evidence. A first responder should create a tracking log. This documents all the steps taken from the beginning of the initial incident response all the way through the end. This tracking log can also show all the steps taken during the forensic process. It can be used to help track internal resources expended on the incidents as well. And these resources can include both man-hours and other expenditures. This tracking log can also be used to justify expenses for management or clients. A type of forensic evidence that's often overlooked are network traffic files and log files. These create a history of events, which is a good source for determining what has occurred on a computer. Network traffic logs and browser history files can show where the system went on the internet and what actions were taken. Log files, as in system log files, application log, or security logs, can help to determine what has occurred with a system. And finally, there's big data analysis. There needs to be recognition that in some situations, big data analyst tools may be required. Big data in this situation refers to any set of data that is too large to analyze with typical data management tools. An example of this would be when analyzing data from a security incident at a financial institution. This can involve multiple exabytes of data. Now that concludes this session on basic forensic procedures. I began by discussing how to recognize the need for forensic procedures, and then I concluded with a brief discussion on basic forensic concepts and procedures. On behalf of PACE IT, thank you for watching this session, and I hope to do another one soon.